Mercedes just won the first race of the 2026 season in Australia. But the result is not what has Formula One talking. What has the paddock on edge is what engineers discovered after the race. Because McLaren and Williams are running the exact same Mercedes engine. The same power unit. The same hybrid system. The same technology. And yet, in Melbourne, the factory Mercedes team appeared to extract almost 0.3 of a second more performance from the exact same engine package. 0.3. From the same supplier. In Formula One, that is the difference between fighting for pole position or starting several rows behind. So teams did what Formula One teams always do. They went straight to the data. Acceleration traces. Hybrid deployment graphs. Energy recovery patterns. And the deeper engineers looked, the more one detail kept appearing. Every time the Mercedes exited a corner, the electrical boost arrived in a perfectly timed surge of power. Sharper. More aggressive. Almost surgical. Something McLaren and Williams still cannot fully reproduce. Now the situation is escalating. Because the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile has started reviewing the technical details surrounding how the Mercedes power unit is being used. Teams are questioning whether Mercedes has discovered a hidden advantage inside the new 2026 engine regulations. A clever interpretation. A revolutionary energy deployment model. Or something even more disruptive. If it is legal, Mercedes may have just unlocked the biggest technical advantage of the new era. But if the governing body believes the design pushes the rules too far, the controversy that started at the Australian Grand Prix could become the first major investigation of the season. And once you see the data engineers found in Melbourne, you understand exactly why the entire Formula One paddock is suddenly watching Mercedes very closely. The tension inside the paddock did not start during the race. It started later, when the garages became quiet, when engineers finally opened the telemetry from the Australian Grand Prix. Because once the data from Melbourne began circulating between teams, something immediately caught their attention. The Mercedes acceleration traces looked different. Not just faster. More controlled. More precise. When the car exited slow corners at Albert Park, the hybrid system delivered electrical power in a perfectly timed burst. Not too early. Not too late. Exactly when the rear tires reached maximum traction. That detail may sound small. But in modern Formula One, it can completely transform lap time. Because under the 2026 regulations, the hybrid system now provides a much larger percentage of the car's total power. Electrical deployment can reach around 100 kilowatts in certain phases of the lap. Which means energy management has become one of the most important performance factors in the entire sport. And this is where Mercedes appears to have an advantage. When McLaren engineers compared their own data to the factory Mercedes car, the difference became obvious. They had the same engine, the same hardware, but the behavior of the system was not the same. Andrea Stella later explained that McLaren currently feels like it is still discovering how the new power unit behaves. The team runs the car, studies the data, then reacts. Instead of arriving at the race weekend with a fully predictable model of how the engine will perform in every scenario. In other words, they are still learning. Mercedes already seems to know. And that difference in understanding can easily translate into several tenths of a second. Williams experienced something similar. Team principal James Vowles admitted that the team only realized how big the gap really was during qualifying in Australia. That was the moment Mercedes unleashed the full potential of the engine. And suddenly the performance difference became impossible to ignore. Early estimates inside the paddock suggest that nearly 0.3 of a second may come purely from how the factory team exploits the power unit. Not from a different engine. Not from extra hardware. Just from the way the system is used. And that is exactly why the situation is creating so many questions. Because if all Mercedes-powered teams are using the same engine, then the advantage must be coming from somewhere deeper. Possibly the software that controls hybrid deployment. Possibly the internal simulation models Mercedes uses to predict how the battery and engine interact over a full lap. Or possibly something hidden inside the interpretation of the new engine regulations. And that last possibility is exactly why the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile is now watching the situation very carefully. Because if Mercedes has discovered a clever interpretation inside the 2026 rulebook, something that allows them to extract more efficiency from the engine and hybrid system, then the rest of the grid could already be facing a serious problem. A problem that may take months to solve. And the next few races could reveal whether what we saw in Australia was just an early advantage, or the beginning of something much bigger. But as the discussion about the Mercedes advantage continued after the Australian Grand Prix, another theory started gaining attention inside the paddock. And this one goes even deeper. Because some engineers believe the advantage might not only come from how Mercedes manages the hybrid system. It could also come from the combustion engine itself. Before the season even started, several engine manufacturers had already raised questions about one specific part of the new regulations: the compression limits inside the internal combustion engine. Under the 2026 rules, the combustion process is tightly controlled. But like many Formula One regulations, the wording leaves small areas open to interpretation. Tiny engineering decisions, precise calibration strategies, solutions that operate right on the edge of what the rulebook allows. And according to discussions inside the paddock, Mercedes may have found an extremely aggressive interpretation of those limits. Now that does not mean anything illegal is happening. In fact, Mercedes insists that their engine project was developed in close communication with the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. According to the team, technical meetings were held before the season began to ensure that their interpretation of the rules was completely legal. But in Formula One, even when something is technically legal, it does not stop rival teams from asking the governing body to review it again. Because the competitive consequences can be enormous. If Mercedes has found a way to improve combustion efficiency within the regulations, the benefits extend far beyond raw power. Better combustion efficiency means more usable energy. More usable energy means the hybrid system can deploy electrical power more aggressively. And more electrical deployment means stronger acceleration out of corners. Which is exactly the pattern engineers observed throughout the race in Melbourne. That is why the technical discussions behind the scenes are becoming increasingly intense. Engine manufacturers, technical directors, and officials from the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile are all studying the data very carefully. Sometimes these reviews lead to nothing. The design is confirmed to be completely legal. Other times the governing body introduces a technical clarification that changes how a rule should be interpreted. And occasionally, a technical directive forces teams to adjust certain elements of their design. Right now, it is still too early to know which direction this situation will take. But what we do know is that the attention surrounding the Mercedes engine has increased dramatically after just one race. Because if the performance advantage we saw in Australia continues in the next rounds of the championship, the pressure from rival teams will only grow stronger. More questions, more technical meetings, more scrutiny of every detail inside the power unit. And that is exactly how major technical controversies in Formula One usually begin. Quietly, with engineers studying the data, trying to understand something that does not yet make sense. Because if Mercedes truly discovered something hidden inside the new engine regulations, something that allows them to extract more performance than anyone else, then the gap we saw in Australia may only be the first sign of a much bigger problem for the rest of the grid. But the tension did not stop with the technical theories. Because once the Australian Grand Prix ended, the situation inside the paddock quickly began turning political. And in Formula One, politics can be just as powerful as engineering. When one team suddenly appears to have a technical advantage at the start of a new regulation era, the rest of the grid reacts immediately. Technical directors begin asking questions. Engine suppliers start comparing data. And sooner or later, the governing body becomes part of the conversation. That is exactly what is happening now. Because the performance gap seen in Melbourne has created a very uncomfortable situation for teams using the same Mercedes power unit. McLaren, Williams, both know the engine itself is capable of delivering much more performance. They can see it every time the factory Mercedes car accelerates out of a corner. They can measure it in the telemetry. But they still cannot fully reproduce it themselves. That is why some engineers inside the paddock now believe the advantage may come from something even more complex than engine efficiency or hybrid deployment. It may come from integration. The way Mercedes has combined the engine, the battery, the cooling architecture, and the software that manages the entire energy cycle of the car. In modern Formula One, these systems cannot be treated separately. Everything must work together. Every braking zone, every acceleration phase, every moment when the hybrid system decides whether to harvest energy or deploy it. If one team understands that relationship better than everyone else, the performance gain can be enormous. And according to several analysts studying the Melbourne data, this could explain why the Mercedes car looked so stable throughout the race. The energy deployment remained consistent. The battery levels stayed under control. And the drivers were able to deploy hybrid power exactly when they needed it. That level of predictability is extremely valuable. Because when drivers trust the behavior of the car, they can push harder. They can accelerate earlier. They can attack the lap with more confidence. And confidence often translates directly into lap time. But here is the problem for the rest of the grid. If Mercedes truly built a deeper understanding of the entire energy system before the new regulations arrived, catching up may not be easy. These kinds of advantages are not solved overnight. They require months of simulation work, new tools, new software models, and sometimes completely different ways of integrating the engine with the car. That is why the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile is now monitoring the situation closely. Not because there is proof of any rule violation. There is no public evidence that Mercedes has broken the regulations. But when one team appears significantly ahead at the start of a new technical era, the governing body always takes a careful look. Engine data is reviewed, technical interpretations are discussed, and manufacturers meet with regulators to clarify how certain rules should be applied. Sometimes those reviews confirm that everything is completely legal. Sometimes they lead to new technical clarifications. And occasionally they result in directives that slightly change how teams must operate their systems. Right now, nobody inside the paddock knows how this situation will evolve. But after just one race of the 2026 season, one thing is already certain. The Mercedes power unit has become the most talked about technical mystery in Formula One. Because if the advantage seen in Australia continues in the next races, the pressure from rival teams will grow rapidly. More scrutiny, more technical debates, more political tension behind the scenes. And if Mercedes really has found something hidden inside the new regulations, something that allows them to extract more performance than anyone else, then the controversy that started in Melbourne may only be the first chapter of a much bigger story.